She had Dantes written in her eyes, so the lone rancher sat across the fire. Until she slept, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of rust and gold by the dying sun. Jack Thornton had been riding this desolate country for 3 days, following cattle thieves' tracks that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into the wasteland. His horse, a sturdy bay named Copper, snorted and shook his head as they crested another ridge, both rider and mount weary from the chase.
That's when he saw the smoke.
A thin tendril rose from behind a cluster of red rocks, about a mile ahead, barely visible against the darkening sky. Jack's hand instinctively moved to the cold. Out here, smoke could mean anything. Friendly travelers, hostile Indians, or the very rustlers he'd been tracking. But as Copper picked his way down the rocky slope, Jack's weathered face creased with concern. The smoke was too small, too controlled to be a proper camp. It spoke of desperation rather than comfort. As he drew closer, staying low and using the boulders for cover, Jack caught sight of the fire source. A small figure huddled near a meager flame, barely large enough to warm a coffee pot. At first, he thought it might be a child, but as his eyes adjusted to the gathering dusk, he realized it was a woman, small-framed and wearing men's clothes that hung loose on her slight frame. She sat with her back against a large boulder, a rifle across her knees, staring into the flames with an intensity that spoke of vigilance born from fear. Even from this distance, Jack could see the way she held herself, coiled tight as a spring, ready to bolt or fight at the first sign of trouble. He'd seen that posture before, in wounded animals and broken men who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. Jack dismounted and led Copper forward slowly, making sure his boots scraped against the rocks to announce his approach. The woman's head snapped up, and even in the dim light he could see her eyes wide, alert, and filled with a warning as clear as words painted on a sign. Don't come closer. Don't touch. Don't even think about it. Evening, miss, Jack called out when he was still 30 yards away, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. Don't mean to startle you, just a traveler looking for a place to rest for the night. The rifle in her hands shifted slightly, not quite pointing at him, but ready to do so in an instant. Keep moving, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Plenty of desert out there. Jack stopped where he was and studied her more carefully. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair that had been roughly cut short and skin weathered by sun and wind. Her clothes were well made once, but now bore the signs of hard travel, dust, tears, and stains that spoke of weeks on the trail. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They held a kind of weariness that came from learning the hard way that the world could be a dangerous place for a woman alone. Yes, ma'am, there surely is, Jack agreed, making no move to come closer. But this looks like the only decent shelter for miles, and my horse could use the rest. I'll camp over yonder. He gestured to a spot well away from her fire, and be on my way come morning. I said keep moving. The rifle came up a fraction. Jack nodded slowly. I hear you, miss, and I respect it, but I've got to tell you there's weather coming in from the west. Feel that wind picking up. That's not a good sign out here. We're both likely to need whatever shelter these rocks can provide. As if to underscore his words, a gust of wind sent sparks from a small fire dancing into the night. The woman's eyes flicked toward the western horizon, where clouds were building against the stars, then back to Jack. He could see her weighing her options, trust a stranger or face the desert storm alone. You stay where you are, she said finally. Don't come any closer. Yes, ma'am. Jack touched the silver brim of his hat. Mind, if I ask your name? I'm Jack Thornton. She hesitated for a long moment. Sarah. Pleased to meet you, Miss Sarah. I'm going to tend to my horse now, if that's all right with you. She watched him like a hawk as he unsaddled Copper and rubbed the animal down with a handful of dried grass. Jack moved slowly and deliberately, making sure she could see every motion. It dealt with spooked horses and frightened cattle enough to know that sudden movements only made things worse. When he'd finished with copper, Jack gathered some deadwood and built his own fire about 20 feet from Sarah's, close enough to share the shelter of the rocks, far enough away to respect the invisible boundary she'd drawn around herself. The wind was picking up now, moaning through the stone formations like a restless spirit. "Storm's going to be a bad one," Jack said, not looking directly at her as he worked to get his fire going. "These desert storms can be fierce. Flash floods, lightning, hail big as hens' eggs." Sarah didn't respond, but he could feel her watching him. When his fire caught and began to drive back the darkness, Jack settled against his own boulder and pulled some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. He ate slowly, occasionally glancing up at the sky where the clouds were massing like an army preparing for battle. "You're running from something, Miss Sarah?" he asked, quietly. The question hung in the air, between them like smoke. For a moment, Jack thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so softly he almost missed it over the wind. "Aren't we all?" Jack considered that. "Suppose that's true enough. Some folks are running from the law, some from their past, some from themselves. Question is whether you're running toward something better or just away from something bad." Lightning flickered in the distance, still far off, but coming closer. Sarah pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. Jack noticed she was shivering. "Got an extra blanket if you need it," he offered. "No." The word came out sharp and fast. "All right." Jack spread his own blanket over his legs and stared into the fire. "Usi to know a woman reminded me of you. Name was Mary Catherine O'Brien. Irish girl, hair like spun copper and eyes green as spring grass. Met her in Abilene about 5 years back." Sarah said nothing, but Jack could sense her listening. "Mary Cat, that's what folks called her." She had that same look in her eyes. "You do, like she was ready to fight the whole world if it came too close." Turned out she had good reason. Her husband had been, well, let's just say he wasn't much of a man. Be it irregular. Treated her worse than most men. Treated her livestock. The wind ghosted again, stronger now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Jack pulled his hat down low. Mary Cat ran off one night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a little money she'd been hiding from him. Made it all the way to Kansas before her luck ran out. When I found her, she was holed up in an old barn, sick as a dog and half-starved. Thunder rumbled overhead, still distant but getting closer. Sarah had gone very still, her rifle forgotten across her knees. "Took me 3 days just to convince her to let me bring her some food," Jack continued. 3 more before she'd let me get close enough to help her to town. She had that same look you do, like touching was the most dangerous thing in the world. "What happened to her?" Sarah's voice was barely audible over the rising wind. Jack was quiet for a moment, watching the flames dance. "She healed. Took time, took patience, but she healed. Last he heard, she was running a boarding house in Dodge City. Married a good man, a preacher who treated her like she was made of spun gold. They've got 2 young ones now." Lightning split the sky much closer now, followed quickly by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very rocks around them. The rain began in earnest, driving hard against the stone formations. Sarah's small fire sputtered and nearly died before she managed to shield it with her body. "Miss Sarah," Jack called over the storm. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. These rocks will protect us from the worst of it, but you're going to freeze over there." "I'm going to move closer. Not close enough to bother you, just close enough that we can share the heat from both fires." She started to protest, but another gust of wind-driven rain made her gasp. Jack was already moving, dragging his gear and saddle toward the space between their fires. He stopped about 10 feet from her, close enough that the heat from both flames created a pocket of relative warmth, far enough that she wouldn't feel trapped. "There," he said, settling against a boulder. "That's better." Sarah watched him with eyes that never seemed to blink. The storm was in full fury now, rain coming down in sheets and wind howling like a banshee. Lightning illuminated the desert in stark white flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to come from all directions at once. You ever been in a desert storm before? Jack soughed, having to raise his voice to be heard. Sarah shook her head. There's something to see, terribly and beautiful at the same time. Desert, been waiting for this rain, might not see another drop for months. Come morning, if you know what to look for, you'll see flowers blooming in places that looked dead as a doornail. Just hours before, as if to emphasize the storm's power, a flash flood came rushing down a nearby arroyo, carrying debris and making a sound like a freight train. Sarah startled, her hand going to her rifle. It's all right, Jack said calmly. Water's not coming our way. These old-timers who built their camps here knew how to read the land. Built their camps? Indians. This is an old shelter. See those markings on the rock behind you? Jack pointed to some faded symbols carven to the stone. Probably been folks taking shelter here for hundreds of years. We're just the latest. Sarah turned to look at the petroglyphs, her wrist moment of relaxed curiosity since he'd arrived. What do they mean? Water nearby, safe shelter, good hunting, story of the land, you might say. Jack fed another piece of wood to his fire. Every place has its stories, Miss Sarah. Question is whether we're adding a good chapter or a bad one. The storm raged around them for another hour. Jack kept up a steady stream of quiet conversation, stories of his travels, observations about the desert, tales of the animals and plants that called this harsh country home. He never asked Sarah direct questions about herself, never pressed for information she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply filled the space between them with words that had no threat in them, no demand for response. Gradually, Sarah began to relax. Not much. She never let go of the rifle, never moved closer to him, but the rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly. When Jack told a story about a particularly stubborn bull who'd led him on a 3-day chase through cactus country, she almost smiled. You're a rancher? She asked, during a brief lull in the thunder. Small spread up north, more rocks than grass, but it's mine. Jack poked at the fire with a stick. Been working it for about 8 years now, not much to look at, but it's honest work. Alone? Mostly. Got a Mexican fellow, Diego, helps out during roundup. Good man. Makes coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Jack glanced at her. You know anything about ranch work? Sarah shrugged. Some. Grew up on a farm back east. It's different out here. Harder in some ways, easier in others. Man's word means something in this country. Woman's too, if she's got the spine to back it up. Lightning struck close enough to make them both flinch, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to crack the world in half. Sarah dropped her rifle and pressed her hands to her ears, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Easy, Jack said softly. It's just noise, can't hurt you. But Sarah wasn't hearing him. She was somewhere else, somewhere that thunder meant something different and more terrible. Her breathing was quick and shallow, her eyes wide with panic that had nothing to do with the storm around her. Jack fought every instinct that told him to go to her, to offer comfort through touch. Instead, he did the hardest thing possible. He stayed where he was and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. Sarah, Miss Sarah, listen to my voice. You're safe. You're here with me, and you're safe. Whatever you're remembering, it's not happening now. The thunder's just thunder. The lightning's just lightning. You're safe. It took several minutes, but gradually Sarah's breathing slowed. When she looked at him again, her eyes held a different kind of vulnerability, the terrible awareness that she'd shown her weakness to a stranger. I'm sorry, she whispered. Nothing to be sorry for. We all got our ghosts. You don't understand. No, Jack agreed. I don't, and I don't need to. Your business is your business, Miss Sarah. But I want you to know something. Whatever happened to you, whatever put that look in your eyes, it wasn't your fault. And it doesn't define what you're worth. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. How can you be so sure? Because I've seen enough of this world to know the difference between predators and prey. You're no predator, miss. That much I can tell just by looking at you. The storm was beginning to pass, the lightning moving farther east and the rain settling into a steady patter rather than the driving sheets of before. Jack added more wood to both fires, making sure the flames would last until morning. "Why don't you try to get some rest?" he suggested. "I'll keep watch." "I can't. I don't sleep well around." She trailed off. "Around men. I understand." Jack settled back against his rock and pulled his hat down over his eyes. "Tell you what, I'm going to rest my eyes right here where you can see me. If I so much as twitch wrong, you've got that rifle." "Fair enough." Sarah studied him for a long time. Finally she nodded. "Good. Now you try to get some sleep. Morning's going to come whether we're ready for it or not." But sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Jack, though, said fitfully, aware of every small sound. Sarah made as she tried to find a comfortable position against the hard rock. Several times he heard her gasp softly, caught in the grip of some nightmare. But he kept his promise and stayed where he was. It was near dawn when he heard the soft, muffled sounds of crying. Jack opened his eyes to find Sarah sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The sight of her pain hit him like a physical blow, but still he didn't move. "So my battles had to be fought alone, at least at first. My husband," Sarah said suddenly, her voice thick with tears. "My husband and his brother, they said I was their property, said I belonged to them both." Jack's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained gentle. "Where are they now?" "Dead." The word came out flat and final. "Both of them." "Good." Sarah's head came up, surprise replacing some of the anguish in her eyes. "Good. Any man who'd hurt a woman like that deserves killing. Hope it was painful." "It was." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "House fire. They were both drunk, knocked over a lamp. I was in the barn when it started. Could have gotten them out, maybe. But I didn't. Can't say I blame you. The whole town thinks I'm a killer, a murderess. That's why I'm running." Jack, consider this. Town folks got small minds sometimes. They see what they want to see, think what's easiest to think. But running's not living, Miss Sarah. It's just surviving. What else can I do? Where can I go? Anywhere you want. This is big country, and there's places where a person can start over if they've got the courage for it. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Already, Jack could see tiny green shoots poking up from the sand. Desert flowers, beginning their brief, brilliant lives. "See there?" Jack pointed to the emerging blooms. "Desert waits all year for rain like last night. When it comes, everything changes. Ground that looked dead comes alive. Beautiful things grow in the harshest places, Miss Sarah, but only after the storm." Sarah followed his gaze, wonder replacing some of the pain in her expression. "They're beautiful, they are, and they're tough. Have to be, to survive out here." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, watching the desert transform on them. Steam rose from the wet rocks, and the air smelled of sage and rain-washed earth. "Jack," Sarah said finally, "last night when you stayed across the fire, why didn't you try?" "I mean, most men would have. Most men are fools," Jack said simply. "Trust isn't something you can take, Miss Sarah. It's something that has to be given, and it's worth waiting for." Sarah studied his weathered face, reading the truth there. "You really meant it, didn't you, when you said whatever happened wasn't my fault? Everywhere. And you think I could really start over somewhere? Be something other than a victim or a killer?" Jack made her eyes steadily. "I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Takes courage to survive what you survived. Takes even more courage to trust again. But I think you've got both kinds." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. Your ranch, you said it needed work. Always does. Ranch work's never finished. You think, would you consider taking on another hand? Someone who works hard and doesn't ask for much? Jack smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him. Miss Sarah, I think that might be the best offer I've had all year. But I should warn you, the work's hard, the pay's not much, and the accommodations are pretty basic. You don't need much, just a chance to be something other than afraid. Then I'd say you've come to the right place. Jack stood and began breaking camp. Ready to see what's on the other side of this desert? Sarah shouldered her rifle and rolled up her thin blanket. For the first time since he'd found her, she moved without the constant vigilance of prey. Ready, as they prepared to leave the ancient shelter, Sarah paused to look once more at the petroglyphs carved into the stone. You think whoever made these markings found what they were looking for? Jack studied the symbols, then looked out at the vast desert, stretching endlessly in all directions. I think they found enough to keep going. Sometimes that's all any of us can ask for. They mounted their horses and rode out into the morning sun, leaving the shelter that had protected them through the storm. Behind them, the ancient markings caught the light, silent testament to all the travelers who had found refuge in that place and moved on toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. The desert flowers, brilliant and brief, bloomed around them as they rode north toward a future neither could predict, but both were finally brave enough to face. 3 days later, they reached Jack's ranch, a modest spread nestled in a valley where grass grew thick and a clear stream ran year-round. The house was small but well-built, the barn sturdy, the corral strong. Diego the Mexican hen, Jack had mentioned, greeted them with curiosity, but no questions. He'd learned long ago that Jack Thornton was a good judge of character. Sarah took the small room in the back of the house, the one with a door she could lock and the window she could escape through if needed. But as the days passed into weeks, she found herself using the lock less and looking toward the window, not as an escape route, but as a view of the mountains she was learning to call home. The work was hard, as Jack had promised. Sarah learned to mend fences, to doctor sick cattle, to read the sky for signs of weather. Her hands grew calluses, her skin brown from the sun. The haunted look gradually faded from her eyes, replaced by something that might eventually become peace. Jack never pressed, never pushed, never asked for more than she was ready to give. He simply was there, steady as the mountains, reliable as sunrise, patient as winter. When Sarah finally smiled without reservation, he considered it a victory worth celebrating. When she laughed at one of Diego's terrible jokes, he felt like he'd witnessed a miracle, and on the night she finally fell asleep by the fire without her rifle in her hands, Jack knew that sometimes the best thing a man could do was stay across the flames until the healing was done. The desert had taught them both that beautiful things could grow in the harshest places. All they needed was patience, the right conditions, and someone willing to wait for the storm to pass. In the end, that was